I think I might hold the unofficial world record for the most extreme response to an HOA parking violation. Ever seen an HOA patrol truck? One of those obnoxiously branded Ford Rangers with the flashing amber lights, nose first in an 8-foot pit? No? Well, pull up a chair, because you're about to hear exactly how that happened, and trust me, it's a story worth telling. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, because this tale of suburban warfare, meticulously planned retribution, and the sweet, sweet taste of justice is something else. It all started, as these things often do, with a little bit of overreach, a whole lot of entitlement, and one homeowner, that's me, who'd simply had enough. My name's Mark Henderson, and for most of my life, I ran a decently successful excavation and light demolition company. Hard work, honest work. When I retired, I wanted peace, quiet, and a perfectly manicured lawn. I bought a nice house in what I thought was a tranquil, planned community, a little slice of green to call my own. The HOA, initially, seemed reasonable enough. Basic rules about lawn care, trash cans, nothing too draconian. Then came Brenda Milligan. Brenda, elected HOA president about 6 months after I moved in, was a force of nature. Not in a good way. She was the kind of woman who probably ironed her socks and color-coded her grievances. She saw the HOA not as a community organization but as her personal fiefdom, and herself as its undisputed queen. Within weeks, new rules appeared, laminated and tacked to every community bulletin board. Rules about the precise shade of beige your curtains could be, the acceptable decibel level of children's laughter during quiet hours, which seemed to be 24/7, and the dire consequences of unapproved mailbox flags. And then came the HOA Community Patrol. This was Brenda's crowning achievement. A 2-man security detail in a leased Ford Ranger, complete with the HOA logo, Community Patrol, stenciled on the side, and those ridiculous flashing amber lights. The patrolmen, a Tweedledee and Tweedledum duo named Gary and Stu, looked like they'd flunked out of mall cop training but retained the attitude. Gary, the driver, was perpetually red-faced and wheezing, while Stu, his passenger, had a habit of polishing his sunglasses even indoors. Their primary mission, as far as I could tell, was to drive very slowly around the neighborhood, glare at anyone whose grass was a 1/4 inch too long, and, apparently, use my front lawn as their personal parking spot. The first time it happened, I was more confused than angry. I was in my kitchen, making coffee, and saw the Ranger pull up, its front tires neatly planted on my immaculate Kentucky bluegrass, about 3 feet onto my property. Gary and Stu got out, stretched, and began a leisurely stroll down the street, peering intently at Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning petunias across the way. I walked out, a polite smile fixed on my face. "Excuse me, gentlemen," I said, my voice calm. "This is my private property. Could you please not park on the lawn?" Gary, who had a paunch that strained the buttons of his too-tight security shirt, gave me a once-over, a sort of dismissive up-and-down look. HOA business. He grunted, as if that explained and excused everything. Stu just smirked. "We'll only be a minute," he added, turning to follow Gary. They weren't. They were a good 20 minutes, leaving 2 distinct tire tracks on my recently fertilized turf. I fumed, but let it go. Maybe it was a one-off, a misunderstanding. It wasn't. 2 days later, there they were again. Same spot. This time, I was firmer. "Look," I said, walking out before they could even switch off the engine. "I asked you not to park here. This is my lawn, not a community parking lot. There's ample street parking right there." I pointed to the completely empty curb 20 feet away. Gary actually rolled his eyes. "We need a strategic observation point," he declared, puffing out his chest. "This spot provides optimal visual access to several properties currently under scrutiny for violations." Optimal visual access? They were staring at Mr. Henderson's slightly peeling porch paint. Stu chimed in. President Milligan, said we have discretion on where we conduct our patrols. The audacity was breathtaking. I took a deep breath. "Your discretion ends where my property line begins. I'm asking you again, politely, to move your vehicle." Gary snorted. Actually snorted. Then slowly, grudgingly, backed the Ranger onto the street, leaving another set of impressions on my grass. That night, I dug out my property survey. My lawn was, unequivocally, mine. I checked the HOA CCRs, pages and pages of Brenda's recent additions, and found nothing granting the HOA or its representatives the right to park on private lawns without owner consent. In fact, there were several clauses about respecting private property. The hypocrisy was galling. The next morning, I drafted a polite but firm letter to the HOA board, addressed to President Milligan, detailing the incidents and requesting that her patrol cease using my lawn as a parking space. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested. I even included photographs of the tire tracks. A week went by. No response. The tire tracks on my lawn, however, were refreshed with disturbing regularity. Gary and Stu seemed to take a perverse pleasure in it now, sometimes giving me a little wave as they pulled onto the grass. My politeness was evaporating, replaced by a simmering rage and a growing sense of disbelief. This wasn't just an annoyance anymore. It was a deliberate act of disrespect, a flaunting of power by Brenda and her bumbling enforcers. My beautiful lawn, the symbol of my peaceful retirement, was becoming a battleground. And Brenda Milligan, with her laminated rules and her tin pot security force, had just severely underestimated her opponent. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought I was just some quiet old retiree. She didn't know that for 30 years I'd moved earth, reshaped landscapes, and occasionally made inconvenient structures disappear. The idea, the beautiful, audacious idea, was starting to percolate. They wanted to park on my lawn? Fine. I'd make sure it was a truly memorable parking experience. The game was on. The certified letter I sent to Brenda, Queen of the cul-de-sac Milligan, apparently served only as kindling for her ego. The parking continued, almost defiantly. Each new set of tire tracks felt like a personal insult. A tiny, muddy finger ground into my eye. My Kentucky bluegrass was starting to look less like a putting green and more like a poorly maintained motocross track. I even suspected one of their tires had crushed a sprinkler head. The coverage in that corner was definitely off. My patience, never an infinite resource, was rapidly depleting. It wasn't just the grass anymore. It was the principle. It was the sheer arrogance of it. I started documenting everything with the meticulousness of a crime scene investigator. I bought a small notepad and a pen I kept by the kitchen window. Dates, times, duration of parking, which goon was driving. Gary usually. Stu occasionally when Gary was off on a donut run, I presumed. I took photos with my phone, hundreds of them, from different angles, time-stamped. Close-ups of the tires deeply embedded in the sod. Wide shots showing the whole truck squatting on my property while the street lay invitingly empty. I even invested in a discreet wildlife camera, the kind hunters use, and mounted it camouflaged in the maple tree by my driveway. It gave me a perfect view of the offending section of lawn, capturing Gary and Stu in all their inconsiderate glory, sometimes even picking their noses or engaging in what looked like heated debates about sports teams while technically on patrol. Allies were scarce initially. This was a neighborhood where conformity was king, and Brenda's reign, though new, was already surprisingly effective at quashing dissent. People would see the HOA truck on my lawn, shake their heads, and hurry inside. But then, old Mrs. Gable from 2 doors down, a woman whose garden was her pride and joy and who possessed an eagle eye for neighborhood transgressions far more legitimate than those Brenda hunted, stopped me one morning. "Mark, dear," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, "I see those horrible men on your lovely lawn nearly every day. It's a disgrace." That Brenda, she's got them thinking they own the place. Her words were a small balm. Knowing someone else saw the injustice was validating. She'd even seen them laughing as they got out of the truck, pointing at my increasingly distressed turf. The final straw, with polite measures, came when I tried to speak to Brenda directly. I caught her as she was alighting from her golf cart, a brand new, top-of-the-line model, by the way, also HOA funded, complete with a little HOA president plaque on the dash, near the community pool. President Milligan, I began, trying to keep the tremor of anger out of my voice. About the patrol truck continuing to park on my lawn. She cut me off, holding up a hand adorned with several chunky, probably costume rings. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I've received your communication." She made communication sound like something one might scrape off their shoe. "Our community patrol requires strategic positioning to ensure the safety and compliance of all residents. Your lawn, while I'm sure precious to you, offers an unparalleled vantage point. Perhaps you should consider the greater good instead of focusing on a few blades of grass." A few blades of grass? I could feel the blood pressure rising. "The greater good doesn't entitle your employees to trespass and damage private property," I retorted, my voice sharper than I intended. "There are bylaws against that very thing. Bylaws you, I believe, had a hand in strengthening." She smiled, a tight, unpleasant little smile. "Interpretations vary, Mr. Henderson, and as president, my interpretation carries significant weight. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have important community matters to attend to." She then breezed past me, leaving me fuming in her wake. That was it. No more Mr. Nice retired excavation expert. The time for gentle persuasion was over. The beast had been poked too many times. It was time to consult my own professional expertise. That evening, I sat down with a notepad, not for logging their trespasses, but for planning my response. My mind, long accustomed to dealing with spoil removal, load-bearing capacities, and ground stabilization, went into overdrive. I wasn't just going to make a point, I was going to make a statement. The initial, more civilized step was to escalate the warnings. The next morning, I visited the local hardware store and purchased 2 sturdy metal signposts and materials for custom signs. Back in my workshop, I meticulously crafted 2 signs. They were professional-looking, white with bold black lettering. "Private property, no HOA vehicle parking. Violators will be towed at owner's expense. Surveillance in operation." Clear, unambiguous, and entirely legal. I installed them myself, one at each end of the affected lawn section, ensuring they were highly visible from the street. I took photos of the newly installed signs, with that day's newspaper clearly visible for dating purposes. Gary and Stu arrived for their afternoon patrol like clockwork. I watched from my window as Gary pulled up, slowed, and then actually pointed at one of the signs, nudging Stu. They both laughed. Then, with a cavalier shrug, Gary steered the Ranger right onto my lawn, parking squarely between the 2 brand-new, clearly worded signs. The wildlife camera captured it all. The approach, the pause, the shared chuckle, the deliberate act of defiance. That footage became Exhibit A in my growing mental file labeled Brenda's Comeuppance. My resolve hardened like quick-set concrete. They thought this was a game? They thought my signs were a bluff? Fine. They clearly needed a more visceral deterrent. They needed to understand that some property lines are not to be crossed. My next visit wasn't to the hardware store, but to my old contacts in the equipment rental business. The plan forming in my head was grand, a little bit crazy, and, I had to admit, deeply satisfying. The laughter of Gary and Stu as they ignored my professionally made "no parking towing zone" signs echoed in my head for days. It was the kind of laughter that dismissed any notion of consequence, the chuckle of petty tyrants who believed themselves untouchable. Brenda Milligan, through her proxies, had thrown down the gauntlet. She thought a few sternly worded signs were the extent of my capabilities. She had mistaken my patience for weakness. She was about to get an education in applied geotechnics, Henderson style. My previous career wasn't just about digging holes. It was about understanding the earth, its limits, its potentials. And the potential I was most interested in right now was its ability to temporarily inconvenience a certain Ford Ranger. The towing threat was clearly insufficient. They were either too arrogant to believe it, or knew Brenda would cover the bill, chalking it up to necessary operational expenses for her vital security force. I needed something more immediate, more impactful, something that spoke their language, the language of blatant, unignorable consequences. The idea of the pit, initially a fleeting, almost comical thought, began to take serious root. It wasn't about destroying their vehicle, mind you. I'm a professional. Vandalism is for amateurs. This was about containment, about making a very physical point. It was about leveraging my unique skill set to solve a unique problem. My backyard still housed a few relics of my old trade: a trusty heavy-duty spade, a pickaxe, a couple of sturdy wheelbarrows, and, crucially, the know-how. The chosen spot was obvious. The exact patch of lawn Gary and Stu favored. The area now bearing the unfortunate pattern of their tire treads, nestled conveniently between my two ignored warning signs. It was approximately 10 feet long and 5 feet wide. An 8-foot depth seemed appropriate, deep enough to make a statement, deep enough to ensure the truck wasn't going anywhere without significant assistance, but not so deep as to risk instability to the surrounding area if done correctly. I knew my soil type. It was mostly clay after the first foot of topsoil, relatively stable for a temporary excavation of this sort. I started the landscaping improvement project, as I cheerfully told a curious Mr. Henderson when he peered over the fence on a Friday evening after Gary and Stu had clocked off for the weekend. I worked with a focused intensity, fueled by months of frustration and the anticipated satisfaction of the outcome. The initial breaking of the turf was the hardest, but once I was through the grass roots and into the topsoil, the digging became rhythmic. Shovel, lift, toss into the wheelbarrow. Wheelbarrow, trundle to the back of the yard, dump onto a large tarp I'd laid out to protect the rest of my lawn and to make eventual backfilling easier. I worked by the light of a strategically placed outdoor spotlight, feigning some late-night gardening enthusiasm. By Saturday afternoon, the main excavation was complete. It was a surprisingly neat rectangle, its sides fairly vertical due to the clay. 8 feet deep is a significant hole when you're standing at the bottom of it. I even added a slight ramp at one end internally, thinking ahead to their eventual vehicle extraction. My back ached, my hands were blistered, but a grim smile was plastered on my face. Now for the crucial part: the camouflage and the new signage. The old signs were clearly not specific enough for these HOA luminaries. This time, I spared no expense on clarity. I went to a professional sign maker, the kind that does official street signs, and had 2 new warnings printed on heavy-gauge aluminum. The wording was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive legalese I'd concocted after an evening spent browsing obscure property law forums and recalling some particularly dense contract clauses from my business days. Each sign, in large, unmissable block capitals, read, "Private property. Absolutely no parking or trespassing. Unauthorized vehicles, parked or driven on this grassy area, will be presumed abandoned and subject to immediate on-site immobilization and/or relocation by subterranean displacement, utilizing pre-existing ground installations. Vehicle owner assumes all risk, liability, and cost for recovery. Entry constitutes acceptance of these terms. You have been explicitly warned." I felt a particular pride in subterranean displacement utilizing pre-existing ground installations. It sounded official, slightly ominous, and entirely accurate. I installed these new, much more intimidating signs in the exact same spots as the previous ones, ensuring they were well lit by my porch light at night. I documented their installation thoroughly. Photos with my phone showing the date and time, close-ups of the wording, wider shots showing their clear visibility relative to the parking spot. I even took a short video narrating the date and time and panning across the signs and the designated area. The camouflage for the pit itself had to be perfect. I constructed a lightweight frame of 2x4s, just robust enough to support a sheet of half-inch plywood. On top of the plywood, I carefully arranged a layer of spare sod I'd saved from another small landscaping project, followed by a generous scattering of loose grass clippings and leaves to blend it seamlessly with the surrounding lawn. To the casual eye, It looked like a slightly lumpy but otherwise unremarkable patch of grass. It wouldn't hold the weight of a person for long if they jumped on it, but it certainly wouldn't support a Ford Ranger. The critical factor was that it would look solid just long enough for someone to confidently drive onto it. I even tested a corner with my own weight gingerly. The plywood creaked reassuringly. Perfect. The trap was set. The bait, my supposedly inviting, long-suffering lawn, was in place. The warnings were clearer than a freshly Windexed window on a sunny day. All that remained was to wait for the pigeons to come home to roost, or, in this case, the Ranger to come home to sink. There was a certain theatricality to it all that appealed to the old demolition man in me. The careful planning, the setup, and the anticipation of the controlled yet dramatic outcome. Brenda and her patrol clearly thought they were above such mundane things as property rights and clear warnings. They were about to learn that some rules are enforced not by laminated notices, but by the unyielding laws of physics and a very determined retiree. The rest of that Sunday was spent in a state of calm, almost serene anticipation. I even mowed the rest of my lawn, taking particular care around the edges of my little surprise. The week began with an almost palpable sense of anticipation. Every distant rumble of a truck engine made me glance towards the window. Monday morning, however, brought only the garbage truck and a passing Amazon van. Gary and Stu, it seemed, had either taken an extended weekend or Brenda had them on a different route, perhaps ticketing toddlers for riding tricycles on the sidewalk, a new rule rumored to be in the works. I maintained my composure, sipping my coffee, reading the paper, a model of retired tranquility. Tuesday was similarly quiet on the lawn parking front. I did see the HOA Ranger cruise slowly down the street, Gary at the wheel, Stu gazing imperiously out the passenger window. They didn't even glance towards my house. For a moment, a flicker of doubt. Had my previous ignored signs somehow belatedly sunk in? Had Brenda issued a directive? Perish the thought. It was probably just coincidence. The universe, I've found, has a keen sense of dramatic timing. Wednesday morning dawned bright and clear. I was in my kitchen, enjoying a second cup of coffee and admiring the dew on Mrs. Henderson's roses across the street, when I heard it, the unmistakable, slightly gravelly rumble of the HOA Ford Ranger approaching. My heart gave a little thump. Showtime. I moved to the window, positioning myself just out of direct sight but with a perfect view. Sure enough, the white Ranger, amber lights off for once, turned onto our street. Gary was driving, Stu beside him. They slowed as they approached my house. I saw Gary's head turn towards the new, imposing signs. He definitely saw them. I could see his lips move, probably making some dismissive comment to Stu, who nodded, a smirk visible even from my vantage point. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance. It was almost beautiful in its predictability. This was the moment. Gary gestured with his chin towards my lawn, their preferred spot. He gave the truck a little gas, turning the wheel. The front passenger side tire kissed the edge of the grass, then the driver's side tire. For a fraction of a second, as the front axle rolled forward onto the carefully camouflaged plywood, everything looked normal. Then, it happened. It wasn't a catastrophic crash, not a Hollywood explosion. It was more of a sickening, crunching whumph, a sound of yielding earth and tortured metal, followed by a sudden, jolting drop. The front end of the Ford Ranger nosedived, abruptly and unequivocally, into the earth. The back wheels lifted slightly off the ground, leaving the truck pitched at a comical, undignified angle, like a dog doing a downward-facing yoga pose, albeit one that had gone terribly wrong. Dust and a few loose grass clippings puffed up around the hood. Silence. Then, the Ranger's doors flew open. Gary emerged, stumbling, his face a mask of bewildered fury. Stu scrambled out the passenger side, looking pale and shocked, patting himself down as if checking for injuries. They stared at the front of the truck, then at the ground, then back at the truck, their expressions slowly shifting from shock to dawning horror, then to pure, unadulterated rage directed at the world in general. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile, took another sip of coffee, and then, with deliberate calm, walked out my front door. "Morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice pleasant. "Having a spot of bother, are we?" Gary whirled around, his face crimson. "You, Henderson! What in the God-blazes name did you do?" he sputtered, spittle flying. Stu was speechless, just pointing a trembling finger from the truck to me and back again. "Me?" I feigned innocence, widening my eyes. "I haven't done anything. Though it does appear your vehicle has encountered a pre-existing subterranean ground installation. Bit of a surprise, I imagine, when you disregard clearly posted warnings." I gestured nonchalantly with my coffee cup towards the shiny new aluminum signs, one on either side of the now beleaguered Ranger. "Says right there," I continued, "unauthorized vehicles subject to immediate on-site immobilization and/or relocation by subterranean displacement. Seems pretty self-explanatory to me." "You did read the signs, didn't you?" Gary's jaw worked for a moment before he found his voice. This is vandalism. Destruction of HOA property. I'm calling Brenda. I'm calling the cops." "Feel free," I said, shrugging. "My property, my signs, your decision to park in direct violation of those explicit warnings. I believe the term for your truck's current predicament is predictable outcome." By now, a few neighbors were starting to emerge, drawn by the commotion. Old Mrs. Gable was at her window, a delighted grin spreading across her face. Mr. Henderson was on his porch, looking stunned but also, I thought, vaguely amused. The spectacle was drawing an audience. True to his word, Gary was on his phone, squawking indignantly. Stu was pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath, occasionally kicking a clod of dirt that had been displaced by the truck's abrupt descent. The pièce de résistance, however, was the arrival of Queen Brenda herself. She must have broken several land speed records in her presidential golf cart, because she skidded to a halt at the curb in a cloud of dust and righteous indignation not 10 minutes later. Her face was a thundercloud. "Henderson!" she shrieked, before she'd even fully dismounted. "What is the meaning of this outrage? You've damaged HOA property! You've endangered our security personnel!" I calmly took another sip of coffee. "Brenda," I said, using her first name deliberately, which I knew she hated from anyone she considered a subordinate, i.e., everyone. "Good morning. As I was explaining to your team here, they chose to ignore multiple, very clear, very specific warnings posted on my private property. They drove onto my lawn, which they have been repeatedly asked not to do, and encountered an unforeseen consequence. Though, if they'd heeded the signs, it would have been entirely foreseen and avoidable." I gestured again to the signs. "Subterranean displacement, Brenda. It's all there in print." She marched right up to the edge of the pit, peered down at the sorry state of her precious Ranger, its grill now inelegantly sniffing the dirt. Her expensive, probably Italian, loafers were perilously close to the crumbling edge. "This is a deliberate trap. A booby trap. It's illegal," she raged, her voice cracking. "Actually," I said, pulling a small folded packet of papers from my pocket, "copies of my property survey, the photos of the previous violations, the dated photos of the signs being installed, even a printed copy of the relevant HOA bylaws regarding respect for private property, which I'd highlighted. It's a defensive measure on private property, explicitly warned against. They assumed the risk. I even have extensive video footage of them repeatedly parking here, despite previous simpler signs, and footage of them acknowledging and then ignoring these signs just this morning. And as for my lawn feature," I added with a hint of a smile, "I'm an old excavation man, Brenda. Any work I do is to professional standards. That, right there, is what we call an 8-foot engineered depression, perfectly stable for its intended purpose." Brenda looked like she was about to have an aneurysm. Her eyes bulged, and her carefully coiffed hair seemed to vibrate with her fury. The police did arrive, summoned by Gary's frantic call. 2 officers, looking rather unimpressed by the suburban drama unfolding before them. I calmly presented my documentation, the property survey, the photos of the signs, the timeline of events, the certified mail receipts for my unanswered complaints. I pointed out the very specific wording on the warnings. Officer Ramirez, the senior of the two, listened patiently, looked at the truck, looked at the signs, looked at my paperwork, and then addressed Brenda. "Ma'am," he said, his voice neutral, "this appears to be a civil matter. Mr. Henderson has clearly marked his property and posted warnings about the specific consequences of parking here. Your driver chose to ignore those warnings." Brenda sputtered about public safety, HOA authority, and imminent lawsuits. Officer Ramirez just shook his head slightly. "He can put whatever signs he likes on his own property, ma'am, as long as they don't violate city ordinances, and these seem pretty specific to his land. You parked your vehicle on his lawn despite those warnings. You'll need to arrange for its removal." With that, the officers, after ensuring no one was injured and taking a few notes, declared there was no criminal act committed by me, and departed, leaving Brenda looking utterly deflated and apoplectic, surrounded by her immobilized truck and a growing crowd of smirking neighbors. The great HOA ranger had been well and truly grounded. The aftermath of the great HOA ranger grounding was, if I'm honest, even more satisfying than the event itself. Brenda Milligan stood there, momentarily stunned into silence after the police officers drove away, her usual air of imperious command utterly punctured. Gary and Stu hovered nearby, looking like scolded schoolboys, acutely aware of the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered, many of whom were now openly grinning, and a few even discreetly filming with their phones. The news, as they say, travels fast in a close-knit suburban environment, especially news this deliciously schadenfreude-laden. "Well, Brenda," I said, breaking the silence, my tone carefully neutral but with an undercurrent she couldn't possibly miss, "it seems your patrol vehicle is, rather indisposed. You'll want to arrange for a professional recovery service, I imagine. I'd recommend a company with a heavy-duty crane and a delicate touch. Wouldn't want any further damage to HOA property, or of course to my lawn during the extraction." I even managed to keep a straight face. Brenda's eyes narrowed into slits. "You will pay for this, Henderson," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You will pay for the truck, for the recovery, for the emotional distress of my staff." "I don't believe I will," I replied calmly. "As Officer Ramirez pointed out, this is a civil matter precipitated by your team's decision to ignore clearly posted warnings on private property. The signs explicitly state, 'Vehicle owner assumes all risk, liability, and cost for recovery.' That would be the HOA, I believe." I then handed her a neatly printed invoice, one I'd prepared in advance, just in case. "This is for the initial consultation regarding unauthorized long-term parking solutions, and for the provision of a temporary, custom-engineered subterranean vehicle receptacle. Plus, a minor surcharge for failure to heed explicit signage. Let's call it $500 for services rendered to date." Her face went from red to a sort of mottled purple. I thought she might actually swing at me. Instead, she snatched the invoice, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it onto the grass. "My grass, of course. We'll see you in court," she shrieked, before spinning on her heel and storming back to her golf cart, nearly sideswiping Mrs. Gable's prize-winning rose bushes in her haste to depart. Gary and Stu were left standing awkwardly by their marooned chariot. "Guess you fellas will need to call a tow truck," I said, not unkindly. A big one. Getting the ranger out was an ordeal that lasted the better part of the afternoon and provided immense entertainment for the neighborhood. First, a standard tow truck arrived. The driver took one look at the situation, whistled, and said, "Nope, you need a rotator, maybe even a small crane. And that ain't gonna be cheap." Brenda, who had apparently returned to oversee the salvage operation from a safe distance, i.e., the street, fuming silently in her golf cart, was forced to make another series of irate phone calls. Eventually, a massive, heavy-duty wrecker with a rotating crane arm arrived. The process was slow and painstaking. They had to carefully dig around the front of the Ranger, then attach multiple straps and chains. The sound of straining hydraulics and creaking metal filled the air. Of course, in their maneuvering, they managed to churn up another significant portion of my lawn, far beyond the original pit, despite my earlier advice to be delicate. I just made mental notes and took more pictures. The final bill for the extraction, I later heard through the neighborhood grapevine, which had become remarkably efficient, was well into 4 figures, a cost the HOA, meaning all the homeowners, would have to bear. Brenda did try to make good on her threat of legal action. A few days later, I received a cease and desist letter from an attorney, filled with bluster about willful destruction of property and reckless endangerment. I simply forwarded it, along with my extensive file of documentation, photos, videos, copies of letters, the specific wording of the signs, to my niece, Sarah, who happens to be a rather sharp corporate lawyer in the city. Sarah, after reportedly laughing for a solid 5 minutes, drafted a response that was a masterpiece of polite, legal evisceration. It pointed out the repeated documented trespass, the clear and specific warnings, the assumption of risk clause, and countersued for damages to my lawn caused by both the initial parking and the subsequent clumsy recovery of their vehicle, plus my time. She also gently hinted that perhaps Brenda Milligan was overstepping her authority and potentially exposing the HOA to further, more significant liabilities through her actions. We never heard from that attorney again. The real fallout, however, happened at the next HOA board meeting. Apparently, news of Operation Ranger Down and the subsequent hefty recovery bill had spread like wildfire. What was usually a sleepy affair attended by Brenda and her few sycophantic board cronies was packed. Homeowners I'd never seen before were there, armed with questions and grievances. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, bless his slightly timid heart, even stood up and spoke about the intimidation tactics of the patrol, and questioned the exorbitant cost of the security service versus its actual benefit. Others piled on, emboldened. Someone produced phone footage of the truck extraction, another demanded a full audit of HOA spending, focusing on Brenda's golf cart and the discretionary fund she seemed to control. The meeting, by all accounts, descended into chaos. Brenda's attempts to gavel everyone into submission failed spectacularly. Her usual enablers on the board looked distinctly uncomfortable. Gary and Stu were, unsurprisingly, fired shortly thereafter, scapegoats, I imagine, for Brenda's colossal mismanagement. She tried to blame them for disobeying directives and acting rogue, but no one was buying it. The incident had stripped away her veneer of competence and revealed the petty tyrant beneath. The board, under immense pressure from the residents, was forced to act. An emergency session was called. While Brenda wasn't immediately ousted, HOA politics can be notoriously sticky. Her powers were significantly curtailed. A financial oversight committee was formed, stocked with skeptical homeowners. The community patrol budget was slashed, and its duties redefined to something more akin to welcoming new residents and reminding people about leaf collection days, rather than issuing spurious violations. The expensive leased Ranger was returned. As for my lawn, I got a grudging settlement from the HOA for the damage, just enough to cover new sod and some landscaping. I didn't restore the pit area to plain grass, though. I turned it into a rather lovely rock garden with a small Japanese maple in the center. It looks quite striking and serves as a subtle, permanent reminder to anyone who might think of parking there without permission. My quiet retirement isn't quite as quiet as I'd initially envisioned. I'm now that guy who buried the HOA truck, a minor local legend. But it's peaceful in a different way. There's a peace that comes from standing your ground, from using your skills, however unconventional, to protect what's yours. And every time I look at my rock garden, I can't help but smile. Sometimes, to achieve a little surface tranquility, you just have to dig deep, really deep. So, what's the craziest thing your HOA has ever tried to pull? Let me know in the comments. I'm always up for a good story. And if you enjoyed this little tale of suburban justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. You never know what neighborhood drama I'll get dragged into next.